Away, oh hey, away, oh hey, hey, oh, away, oh hey, 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 away, oh hey, 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 away, oh hey, away, oh hey, hey, away, oh hey.
Well, Wapna'kikewi'skwaq Wolastoqiyik. That was the name, my spirit name. A few years ago, I passed tobacco because the knowledge of how to conduct the ceremonies, the name-giving ceremonies, by the time my mother was born, our people had forgotten the knowledge because the church forbid us to practice any of our culture whatsoever. So it took 69 years for my name to catch up to me. So I passed the tobacco, and my elder came. It took a year for him to find out what my name was. And our names are very important because it has to do with what our purpose is here on this earth, why we have come here. Has something to do with our name. So, Wapna'kikewi'skwaq, or in my language, Wolastoqiyik, that means that woman whose voice pierces through. And so it kind of made me stop to think, and I have to realize too that I have to be very careful about how I choose my words when I try to pass a message along. But one of the things I have noticed since that time is that when I introduce myself using my spirit name, sometimes I don't even know what I have said. The message is coming from somewhere, and I really sometimes don't have any control over it. So when I was a little girl, I was adopted at birth, right from the hospital. And my auntie, my biological auntie, was my mom. And my biological mother was my auntie, in my eyes. And that was a custom adoption. In those days, they would take the baby. If the mom was too young or she was not capable or able to look after the little one, then sometimes they would pass that baby to a relative. Sometimes even the grandmother would raise the baby. And sometimes it would be the auntie or somebody, but it was usually always in the family. So that's what happened in my case. But they never told me. They never told me I was adopted. They never spoke of it that way. So she was my mom. And she lived until I was 5 years old. I was almost 6. She died in May, and I started school in September that fall. So I would have been 6 in that September. Now, she spoke to me in the language. My mom was fluent in Maliseet, Wolastoqiyik, and she was fluent in the language. And I remember her telling my dad that she was Catholic too as well, my mom. Probably if she had lived, I probably would be a Catholic too, but I'm kind of glad about that. But anyway, she told my dad about going to confession And the priest was mad because she went to confession in Maliseet. And the priest said, well, speak in English. And she said, why? Well, he said, I can't understand you. And she said, but God does. So that's what she told him. And she refused to go to confession in English. So she had that little bit of activism in her too as well, like that little bit of resistance, in her own way. But I can remember my mom, even though I was that young, and she spoke to me in the language, and she was once she knew that she had 5 years to live, she was concerned about my language. And because we lived, my mom married a non-native. We had a farm at Indian Point, and it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of heaven on the Wapna'kikewi'skwaq, on the beautiful Grand Lake, little piece of heaven. So that's where I grew up from the time I was 2. Before that, they lived in St. John, and I was so glad that they moved the heck out of the city of St. John, because people, it's not a healthy place to live now. So they moved out. We lived in the country. And so she spoke to me in Maliseet. She spoke to the dog in Maliseet. The dog understood her. And I remember telling my dog, Mudgel, get the house. Get home. So our language, there was nothing that we couldn't say in our language. But I was only 5, and so she spoke to me like a little 5-year-old. And after she died, I didn't hear the language. And my dad, bless his soul, he tried to take me to, somebody who can speak. So he would paddle across Back Lake, go across Grand Lake, and then cross the river by canoe. And then we would go visit this old lady. Her name was Mrs. Louis Japley's wife. She would have been an aunt to Lena Nash from Gagetown. It was Lena's aunt. Auntie Anis, that's what they called her, Auntie Anis. But she had a birthmark. She had a huge birthmark on her face over here. And she was a little bit shy about it. And she would wear her hat like a brim hat. And she would hold it like this. So she told my dad, she said, they lived right by the river, just above the high water mark, their little house. And their house was in the ground, like about 2 feet of their house was in the ground. When they went in their house, they stepped down into the house. But it was warm in there. I mean, it was not a big place. But let me tell you, they had about umpteen dogs. And they had these dogs that had the orange nose and the orange eyes, like kind of gold color eyes, and their hair is curly. And when we went to visit, we'd knock on the door and you hear the dogs barking, and I was just little, and they'd just roll out of the door like this, almost knock me down. But that's what kept them warm. They all lived in there together. And there's so many stories. I have so many stories. I got to write a book, I am going to write a book. But, yeah, so he would take me there. And she made the most beautiful homemade donuts. They were like big ones like this. And she'd give me a glass of milk and a donut, a big, big donut. And talk to me in Maliseet. By the time I was 10 years old, she shook her head like this. She told my dad, she said, she's forgetting her language. By the time I was 10. And she was so sad. Like, that's what I remember of her. She was so sad. When she just shook her head like this, she told my dad, she said, she's forgetting her language. Yeah. Because I didn't hear it. I never heard it. And what my mom spoke to me, it was baby, like talking baby talk. So for years, I always had this yearning that there was always something missing. And when I missed it the most was when I went into ceremony and I heard the prayers and I heard the people praying in the language, and I wanted to speak to our ancestors in our language, but I couldn't. I tried, but I couldn't. So when they brought our language immersion program from St. Thomas, it was an outreach. It was an outreach to our community. I went to get a hold of my granddaughter, Tony, Tara's daughter, and I said, let's take it. Let's go. You and I. What do you do? You're not doing anything anyway. We might as well go do this. So she said, okay. And we took it 2 years of language together. And there was kind of like this competition between us. I said, I wasn't going to let her beat me on this. But it kept us on our toes. And when we finished at the top of our class. And the beauty of this program is the fact that in the afternoon we got to practice so many things like tanning hides. We didn't tan the moose hide because it was so hard, but we did tan the deer hides because we only had we were time constraint on us as a part of the class, but but I think the process is very, very similar. Maybe it just takes a little longer for the moose hide because it's thicker, eh? But the deer hide, we tanned it. We picked medicine. We made drums. We made snowshoes. We made snow snakes. We did all kinds of different things. We did beadwork. We made the little purses, little pouches. We did research into the Maliseet designs. So that was what I think made our language program unique. And it generated an awful lot of interest. And even now, they have a full house even now. So I taught, after Tony and I graduated, we both taught for I think 4 years, 3 or 4 years. And I learned just as much teaching as I did in the class. But I have to tell you, I'm not fluent still. I'm still not fluent. It takes more than 2 years to master any language. I would say a minimum of 5 years it should be. And that it would be intense. And there should be a progression. So that's the only recommendation I would say for this program that would improve the program is have it longer, and have so that it ends up being Maliseet, conversational Maliseet. When you finish the program, you should be able to hold a conversation in the language. If the language program, this basically scratches the surface right now, because a person who is a non-speaker learns the language differently than someone who's a lifelong speaker. A lifelong speaker, they've had their whole entire life to learn the language. And there's no pressure, and there's no competition, and there's no, and you hear people speaking. That's how you learn it, by listening and by, chiming in with your, so that, but from the cradle till you're an adult. Well, a learner who's a non-speaker that has to learn the language, you have to learn to understand it first. You have to learn for meaning. You have to know what it means. Otherwise, you could stand there and say a word forever. And if you don't know what it means, you'll never learn to use it. What's the good of it? You know what I mean? So you have to learn for understanding, and you use two different parts of the brain. One for learning what to get an ear for the language, to hear it, to hear the words. The other part of your brain for speaking. So there's two different parts of the brain that are at. So you have to hear the language. You have to hear it, not just to speak it. I can speak it, I can read it, and I can pronounce very well the words if I see it on the paper. But I cannot hold a conversation still. Not a complete conversation. So, and since I left the class, I hardly hear the language. I hardly hear it. Hardly. And that's sad. That's a sad state of affairs in our community. There's no child speakers. The powers that be don't seem to want to have an immersion school. They're still developing curriculum. I think eventually they'll get there, but right now there's people who are teaching who feel threatened by immersion because they're scared they'll lose their job or somebody else will be teaching. There's all these dynamics going on that are still there in the communities. We have lost the ability to work together. We have lost the ability to work together, and support one another and help one another. The language is vital. We cannot go anywhere else in the world to get our language. It comes from this land right here. And there's nowhere else to go to get it. If it's gone from here, it'll be gone from the face of the earth. And we can't let that happen. I hope that we don't let that happen. I know that my granddaughter and Jolene Paul, who's working with her, and everybody who's working on the language program all up and down the river, I know they're doing the very best that they can. And but we need the resources to be provided. We need the space to be provided. They need their own school. We need our own school. And it needs to be in our language. That's what we need. So the students that are in there now, and the ones who graduated from there, they want to do something with the language that they've learned. But it's not developing fast enough to include them. They handpick or something, but it'd be nice if they could really be to work together to develop curriculum, not just handpicked people, but everyone who's interested in doing it. There has to be a role for everybody. There has to be a role for everybody to play in the preservation of our language. There's no time for squabbling and fighting over this while our language dies, because if drastic measures are not taken, our language will be gone within a generation.
Away, oh hey, away, oh hey, hey, oh. Away, oh, hey, 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 away, oh, hey, 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 away, oh, hey,